And good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse. We've been focused on Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, which, most people take that as a prediction of a yet future time, the end of the current Christian age, etc., when all nations are literally physically gathered before God's tribunal. Pardon me. It is assuredly seen as the time of the resurrection. Now, what I've been sharing with you, and will continue to do so for a good little bit here, is the connection between Daniel chapter 12, Matthew 25, 31 and following, and Revelation chapter 11. And the reason for that being, pardon me, Daniel chapter 12 clearly predicted the resurrection. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Matthew chapter 25 is clearly about the resurrection. Just as Revelation chapter 11, 15 and following is about the resurrection. It is the time of the dead that they should be judged, and the time of your servants and the prophets that they should be rewarded. Resurrection. So there's no question that we have a continuous line here. So yesterday, I began sharing with you an absolutely astounding fact from Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12 posits the time of the Great Tribulation. Daniel 12:1. At that time there shall be tribulation, such has not been since there was the beginning of the nation, or ever yet shall be. Well, as I noted yesterday, some former preterists, and certainly in the scholarly world, it is very common to hear the argument made, well, Daniel 12:1, the time of the Great Tribulation, that's the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Oh, but wait a minute. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, many of those who sleep in the dust shall arise, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting condemnation. That's the end of time. Well, as I pointed out to you yesterday, if that's true, number one, it's ironic that both amillennialists and postmillennialists who make that argument, all right, they condemn the dispensationalists for inserting gaps between the 69th and the 7th week of Daniel. But they turn around on Daniel chapter 12 and they insert a 2,200-year gap between Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 and Daniel chapter 12 verse 2. That's 2,200 years and counting. So there is no consistency whatsoever in that paradigm. But also, I pointed out yesterday why it's absolutely inconsistent. It's not historical to claim that the Great Tribulation of Daniel 12:1, which will be ostensibly the greatest ever since there was a nation, period. Because, to reiterate, the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC was greater than that of the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. The destruction in AD 70 was far, far greater than anything that Antiochus Epiphanes did. There is literally no comparison. They're apples and oranges. And so it's absolutely not historical or historically accurate to say that Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 was the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. But what I introduced to you yesterday is to me one of the most astoundingly critical, unbelievably important realities that is, as Brent Petrie points out in his book, Jesus, Tribulation, and the End of Exile, is essentially overlooked in the scholarly literature, There are a few who notice it. But in the literature and in the biblical narrative, some scholars recognize this, as I mentioned, Brent Petrie, but most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to quote some scholars for you here in a moment, who recognize the connection on one level, and then they ignore it when the application is made to Jesus and the New Testament teaching. Here's what I mean. In the biblical narrative, in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, there is a direct, unbreakable connection between the time of the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. Now, the Jews believed that the Great Tribulation immediately preceded the resurrection. Please catch the power of this. Here's what a few scholars, now I'm reading from my book, The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, fulfilled or future, page 159, as I document from scholarship that the concept of the relationship between tribulation and resurrection is absolutely accurate. Emil Schurer, who, let me read, quote, is considered one of the greatest authorities on early Jewish history and beliefs, said that in Jesus' day, quote, reference to the last things is almost always accompanied by the notion, recurring in various forms, that a period of special distress and affliction must precede the dawn of salvation. In rabbinic teaching, the doctrine therefore developed of the birth pangs of Messiah, which must precede his appearance. And that expression is from Hosea 13:13, compare Matthew 24 and verse 8, unquote. Mark Dubus, a noted scholar, chronicles this very same pattern. And, what sticks out in my mind as I read these comments is how well the pattern is reflected in the New Testament. But nonetheless, I mentioned Brent Petrie. Here's what he has to say. According to the Old Testament, the resurrection itself would be preceded by a period of great tribulation. Daniel chapter 12, which is the most explicit prophecy of resurrection in the Hebrew books of the Old Testament. Strikingly, this description of the resurrection is preceded by the Great Tribulation. So, the scholars recognize that there's a direct connection between Great Tribulation and resurrection. Okay, what are some of the passages? Well, as just a few of them, and by the way, in this book, I chronicle a great number of Old Testament passages, as well as the New, that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this narrative of tribulation, or let me back up and say, abomination, tribulation, resurrection, is absolutely biblical. What so many of the scholars either ignore or overlook is that the tribulation, the abomination, and the tribulation would be upon Israel. It is not a time of, quote, worldwide tribulation. It is tribulation against Israel. Classic example. In Isaiah chapter 24, the Lord said, the earth is destroyed. The earth is clean broken up. The earth is dissolved. For, here's the reason why. this destruction of Isaiah chapter 24 and verse 5 is to take place, or was to take place. For they, who's the they, for crying out loud? We'll find out in a moment. For they have violated the everlasting covenant. Who did God have a covenant with, for crying out loud? Oh, that would be Old Covenant Israel. So here's destruction coming on the, quote, earth, the Eretz, better translated as land here, because they violated the everlasting covenant. Now, in Hosea, the contemporary parallel book of Isaiah, it specifically identifies, and the passage is parallel, it identifies Israel as the one guilty of violating the everlasting covenant. There in Isaiah chapter 24, the Lord in verses 9 and following continues that prediction of the destruction, saying it would be upon, quote, the city of confusion. Well, what city of confusion is that? Chapter 29 calls it Ariel, i.e. Jerusalem. So here's a judgment on the people, on the land, for violating the everlasting covenant. Oh, and it's the city that dwells in the midst of the land. And according to Ezekiel 5, 8, 9, that's Jerusalem. And it is the people who dwell in the city in the midst of the land. That was the destruction that was coming. Okay, so ask yourself the question, who was the people dwelling in the city of Jerusalem, the city of confusion, that dwelt in the midst of the land that Ezekiel 5, 8, 9 specifically identifies as Jerusalem? So now we know who it is that's under judgment. And in Isaiah chapter 24, 19 and following, once again, the earth is destroyed, the land is destroyed, but Isaiah chapter 24, the last two verses of the chapter, as a result of that chapter, what happens? God rules gloriously in Zion. Tribulation before the kingdom. Well, what's the kingdom? The kingdom is brought in by the resurrection. And I got to hurry. Isaiah chapter 25 continues that discussion. There is no chapter break in the Hebrew, but in chapter 25, the prophet marvels at the judgments of God, and he says, you have made this city of confusion a ruin, a desolation, and you turned over the temple to foreigners. Tribulation. On whom? Jerusalem and the temple. Oh, but wait. Chapter 25, 6 to 8. On this mountain the Lord shall make a great feast. A feast of fat things. A feast of wine on the lees. And the curse that has covered all the nations shall be removed. For the Lord shall swallow up death in victory. Chapter 25, verse 8. So what do we have? Destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, messianic banquet, resurrection. Isaiah chapter 27. Has he slain Israel? As he has slain those who killed her? Yes, in measure, by sending it away. But this is the means by which he will remove the sin of Israel. So here's the promise of the removing of the sin of Israel, which according, by the way, Romans 11, chapter 11, verse 15, is nothing less than resurrection. And at that time, what do we find? Oh, the fortified city would be laid desolate at the time when he turns the altar to chalkstone, when the people whom he had created would no longer receive mercy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's 3 passages in just 3 chapters in which the Bible emphatically, explicitly, undeniably posits resurrection, the kingdom, salvation at the time of the tribulation. Oh, by the way, Isaiah chapter 26, I'm sorry. 10 and following, Lord, we have been in trouble. We have been in agony. We have been as a woman in travail who sought to bring forth, but brought forth only wind. Lord, we sought for salvation, but we found none. Oh, but wait. Those who dwell in the dust shall arise. That's Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. They shall sing. It shall be as the dew of the morning, and they shall sing for salvation. Lord, we've been in travail. We've been in trouble. But we couldn't bring forth salvation. Oh, but wait, you will raise us up. This motif, this narrative of travail, of tribulation. Now, here's the point of this. No, I'll make my point. I'll make my point on this next Monday. In the meantime, okay, read Matthew chapter 24, verse 15 through 34, and see what you find about the abomination of desolation, the Great Tribulation, and the resurrection, keeping in mind that Matthew 24:31 is a direct citation to Isaiah 27:13, which was a prediction of the resurrection. Okay, now don't forget, tomorrow we will continue our examination of why N.T. Wright is wrong on the redemption of creation. I'll see you on the flip side.